The rain that evening was not the pleasant, intermittent sort that leaves a sheen of light upon the pavements and makes the lamps seem theatrical in their reflection. It was a rain that pressed itself relentlessly against the windows of the Randolph, forcing every passer-by to hunch beneath umbrellas, heads bowed as though ashamed of something unseen. From my corner table in the hotel bar, I watched the street darken, the headlights of cars spreading themselves into elongated prisms across the wet stone, and thought how unbecomingly cruel it was to arrive at a case in such weather. Oxford, so often patient with me, was that night a city of dripping gutters and muffled voices. Beaumont Street is a thoroughfare I have walked countless times, yet that evening it looked different, as streets always do when one is summoned to tragedy. I had received the call late in the afternoon, a constable's cautious voice relayed through the station. An elderly woman, anonymous for the moment, had been found dead in a small lodging house not 50 yards from the Ashmolean. Nothing obviously violent, they said, though the circumstances troubled them sufficiently to call me. I finished the last of my whiskey, no ice, never ice, and pulled my coat collar higher as I stepped into the wet. Memory works in peculiar ways. I cannot tell you the exact date now, though I could name the brand of tobacco smoke that lingered in the entrance hall of the lodging house. Player's Navy cut. Someone, perhaps the landlord, had smoked just before my arrival, and the blue residue clung obstinately to the damp wallpaper. Small details like that remain with me long after the larger facts fade. The landlord himself was a nervous man of indeterminate age, with hair that seemed perpetually unbrushed. He wrung his hands as he spoke, as though squeezing water from them. He told me he had gone to check on the lodger, Miss Whitstable, a retired governess, 74 by his reckoning, when she failed to descend for supper. He had found her seated by the fire, book open, spectacles perched still upon her nose, but her chest unmoving. Peaceful, he said, almost pious. And yet something in his voice suggested the opposite unease, the shadow of guilt, perhaps. I asked to see the room. It was on the first floor, reached by a staircase that creaked at each tread, like an elderly professor clearing his throat before a lecture. The door had been left open, the constable standing stiffly by. I nodded him aside and entered. She sat exactly as the landlord described her, upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, as if expecting an audience. The book upon her knee was a volume of poetry, Wordsworth, of all things, open at the sonnets. I noticed immediately that the page edges were dry. In a room as damp as that, with rain hammering against the window, it struck me oddly. The fire in the grate was little more than embers, though the poker showed signs of recent use. I bent closer. It was not the stillness of natural death that disturbed me, but a detail so small it might have been overlooked. The spectacles perched on her nose bore a smear across one lens, a greasy fingerprint unmistakable in the lamplight. But it was the wrong lens. She was right-handed according to the position of pen and notepaper on the small desk, yet the smear lay on the left lens, precisely where no habitual gesture of hers would have placed it. Someone else had touched them. Someone who had perhaps replaced them after she no longer needed them. I said nothing to the landlord. Instead, I asked about her visitors. He shifted awkwardly and confessed that she had received only one in recent weeks, a young man, well-dressed, with a manner both respectful and hurried. He had come twice, and on each occasion she had appeared agitated afterward. The landlord knew nothing more, or so he claimed. It was at this moment, staring at the thin curtains that failed to keep out the rain-slick streetlight, that a memory stirred from earlier in the day. I had been working on a crossword in the Times, a particularly vexing one, and a clue had lodged itself in my mind. An uninvited hand rearranges order 8 letters. At the time I had written nothing, but here in this drab room it came back to me with uncomfortable insistence. Intruder? 8 letters? And perhaps more than a coincidence? The constable, young enough still to believe in simple explanations, muttered something about heart failure. I nodded, though I was not convinced. There was too much neatness here, too much arrangement. Death, in my experience, rarely tidies up after itself. Her shoes were set precisely side by side beneath the chair. The letters upon the desk had been stacked with care. Even the ashtray, though unused, had been wiped. It was as if someone had staged a tableau of serenity, and I have always distrusted serenity. Outside, the rain continued its performance upon Beaumont Street, louder now, as though applauding the deception. I drew the curtains a little tighter, examined the latch of the window, and saw a faint smear of mud along the sill. A careless boot, perhaps, entering or leaving. Yet the lock was fastened from within. The paradox pleased me, even as it unsettled me. Locked doors, barred windows, the illusion of safety are all constructs that crumble when weighed against human ingenuity. I left the room with a heaviness I could not yet name. The landlord fussed behind me, asking whether he might fetch tea, but I waved him away. I stepped again onto Beaumont Street, where the rain greeted me like an old adversary. Across the way, the Randolph stood in warm illumination, promising another whisky if I wished for it. But I turned instead toward the station, collar pulled high, mind restless. There was, I realized, no rush. Death was certain, only its manner remained in doubt. Yet in that doubt lay the whole of my vocation, my curse and my comfort. The smear upon a lens, the mud on a sill, the wrongness of neatness they whispered together like a chorus I had heard before and would hear again. And as I walked down Beaumont Street with rain streaming into the gutters, I remembered another line from Wordsworth, one Miss Whitstable might have read in her final hour, "The world is too much with us late and soon." It was, I thought, an epitaph both adequate and insufficient. But then, so are most. The following morning brought with it no reprieve from the weather. Oxford lay drowned beneath a lingering drizzle, the stones of Beaumont Street exhaling steam, as though the entire city were sighing under some private grief. I walked toward the Ashmolean with reluctant steps, for the museum had summoned me by way of a message delivered through the station. Another body, they said, found before the galleries opened to the public. The curator's voice, clipped and precise over the telephone, had trembled nonetheless at the word. There is always something unsettling about entering the Ashmolean before its proper hour. The silence is less a peace than a kind of vigilance, as though the marbles themselves lean forward to overhear one's breath. A constable guided me through a side entrance, his shoes squeaking upon the polished floors. Somewhere beyond, the hum of the building's heating system filled the air, like an organ note sustained too long. The body lay in the Greek and Roman gallery, among statues that appeared far more alive than the woman sprawled at their feet. A middle-aged figure, expensively dressed, her coat folded oddly beneath her, as though she had collapsed mid-sentence. The guard who discovered her insisted she had not been there when he made his final round the night before. He found her at dawn, her face tilted upward toward a headless marble torso, as though awaiting its whispered judgment. I crouched beside her, ignoring the shifting impatience of the constable. The woman's handbag had been set with unnatural care upon a nearby pedestal, clasped shut, unperturbed by the violence of collapse. Her shoes gleamed too brightly for weather such as this. I ran a finger along the strap of the bag and noted the faintest trace of damp clay, the sort used in restorers' work. A presence here, then, in the night. Someone with access, or at least the patience to linger unseen. It is remarkable how death insists on tidiness where life permits only chaos. Her hands were folded loosely across her stomach, yet the nails bore faint crescents of earth. She had grasped at something, perhaps at nothing, before the end. A ring was missing from one finger, the pale indentation betraying its absence. Robbery, one might think, and yet the handbag remained sealed, the purse untouched. I have long since learned that the removal of a ring is rarely about money. It is an intimacy, an act of peculiar symbolism. The thief takes not value but identity. The curator arrived, perspiring despite the cold, his bow tie trembling as he spoke. He knew her, of course, Mrs. Catherine Elsmore, a patron, widow of a barrister known for her devotion to antiquities and her occasional quarrels with the trustees. She had attended a lecture only days before, and had lingered afterward in sharp conversation with a young man described with a sigh as handsome, intense, unsettling. Always the young man, always the visitor. I made a note of his description, though my attention had shifted to the room itself. The statues loomed, the inscriptions upon their plinths muttered in languages only half remembered from school days. I found myself drawn to one fragment of pottery displayed near the body. It bore an inscription I could not translate in its entirety, but the sequence of letters resembled a crossword clue I had wrestled with years earlier, a word meaning both stranger and guest, one that hovered uneasily between welcome and intrusion. Xenos, 6 letters, a word with a shadow duality. How fitting, I thought, for the presence that now haunted our investigation. I asked the curator about the keys. Too many, he admitted, scattered among staff, guards, even external restorers. The museum had never imagined itself a fortress, and why would it? Art, after all, invites visitors. Yet the rain upon Beaumont Street had washed more than stone that night. It had carried footsteps into sanctuaries unprepared for them. The constable suggested heart failure once again. He had the enthusiasm of youth for simple answers. I stood, brushing dust from my knees, and looked about the gallery. No overturned chair, no sign of sudden collapse. Instead, a woman poised like an offering beneath the gaze of antiquity. Death by natural causes is rarely so artful. I asked whether she had enemies. The curator hesitated, then conceded she had argued passionately with the trustees about the provenance of certain pieces. Too passionate, he admitted. She had hinted at irregularities, perhaps even forgeries, dangerous words in the world of benefactors and reputations. I thought again of the missing ring. A lover, perhaps? Or someone eager to silence accusation. The absence gleamed more loudly in my mind than any jewel could. And in its absence, the faint clay upon the handbag strap whispered again. Restoration, forgery, intrusion, each a fragment of the same puzzle, scattered like tesserae from a broken mosaic. The guard who found her shifted uneasily in the doorway. I caught the movement of a hand brushing compulsively at his trouser pocket, again and again, as though ensuring something remained within. Not fear exactly, but the behavior of a man rehearsing innocence. I stored it away in silence, for deduction must grow slowly like ivy over stone, not be yanked impatiently from the soil. The rain outside pressed harder against the high windows, darkening the gallery to a gloom more suited to catacombs than to art. I imagined her walking here the night before, footsteps echoing, eyes lifted toward the statues, unaware that she was herself becoming part of the collection, another relic among relics. Perhaps she had arranged her own posture in some symbolic gesture. Or perhaps another had guided her final placement, as an unseen hand had guided Miss Whitstable's spectacles. The symmetry disturbed me. Too much design in these deaths, too much curation. I left the gallery with reluctance, my coat heavy with the museum's chill. Outside, Beaumont Street offered its usual grey comfort, buses sighing as they stopped, umbrellas colliding in courteous apologies. Yet I could not shake the sense that the city itself was conspiring to arrange its dead in tableau for me alone. A governess by the fire, a widow among antiquities, each death a stanza in some poem I had not yet deciphered, and as I walked back beneath the dripping eaves, I found the crossword clue from the day before still unfinished in my pocket. I filled it in at last. Intruder, 8 letters. Beneath it, in the margin, I wrote another Xenos, stranger, 6. The pattern was beginning to declare itself, though faintly, as though scratched upon glass. Oxford that morning gave me no answers, only rain, and the echo of statues watching silently as one of our own was transformed into marble stillness. The day after Mrs. Elsmore's body was found, I was invited or perhaps summoned into the cloistered heart of one of Oxford's older colleges. A circle of scholars, the note had said. The phrasing had about it the faintly conspiratorial air of a secret society, though in truth it amounted only to the senior common room convened under the pretext of collegial concern. Yet there was tension enough in their invitation to justify my attendance, and curiosity enough in me to accept. The common room exhaled the odour of its years, tobacco ghosting from the curtains, leather chairs softened by generations of elbowed debate, dust rising in half-light from volumes that had not been opened since Victoria sat the throne. The men and one solitary woman among them were arranged almost theatrically about the fire. Their gowns hung over the backs of chairs like empty witnesses listening in silence. The circle, indeed. They greeted me with courtesy tinged with unease. Professors of classics, history, philology, each face drawn into lines of long reading and longer argument. They spoke with studied restraint, as though rehearsing footnotes for posterity. Their interest, they claimed, lay in Mrs. Elsmore's allegations concerning forgeries among the museum's holdings. But I sensed that interest shaded into fear, for accusations against antiquities cast shadows long enough to darken reputations, careers, entire disciplines. Truth in those rooms was both pursued and feared. I listened more than I spoke. A man with narrow spectacles insisted that no genuine scholar could mistake forged clay for ancient, his voice carrying the brittle fervour of someone who had done so. Another with a scholar's beard of improbable whiteness declared that Mrs. Elsmore had fancied herself an expert without warrant, and the woman a lecturer in epigraphy, quiet and precise, observed that Mrs. Elsmore had, in fact, identified anomalies that deserved attention. Her words fell into the circle like stones into a still pond, rippling uneasily. They ignored her thereafter, which told me more than their arguments. I looked about the room and noted the small things, a chessboard in the corner, mid-game, the white queen displaced from its square, a faint ring on the table where a glass had stood too long, a newspaper folded to the crossword page, half completed. I leaned closer and saw an unfinished truth concealed in a scholar's pretense of 7 letters. The answer announced itself without my pencil. Allegro, a word suggesting brightness, swiftness, yet in Italian also implying levity, even deceit. The irony pleased me. Whoever had worked that crossword had abandoned it at the threshold of confession. One of the professors, emboldened by sherry, leaned toward me and asked, what connection, if any, existed between the governess in her lodging-house and the widow among the statues? I allowed that connections rarely declare themselves at once, but that I distrusted coincidence when it appeared in pairs. He looked at me with the nervous smile of a man hoping for reassurance and receiving only silence. The lecturer in epigraphy lingered after the others drifted away to dinner. She spoke with hesitation, glancing toward the heavy oak door as if it might overhear. Mrs. Elsmore had recently consulted her about an inscription on a fragment of amphora. The lettering, she said, did not match its supposed age. Too neat, too deliberate, like handwriting copied without comprehension. She suspected it was a modern imitation. When I asked whether Mrs. Elsmore had mentioned her suspicions to others, the lecturer lowered her eyes. Perhaps to the young man who attended her lecture, perhaps to someone in this very room. Fear shadowed her face as she spoke, and I understood why she chose to whisper. It is a curious thing, fear. It makes scholars cautious, but it also makes them careless. In her nervousness, she twisted the ring upon her finger until it slipped briefly free. Pale skin beneath, untouched by sun. I thought again of the missing ring from Mrs. Elsmore's hand, and wondered whether absence and presence might rhyme more often than we imagine. Rings bind, but they also betray. The bell for dinner tolled, echoing along the cloisters. I excused myself, preferring solitude to the chatter of Latin quotations over roast lamb. Outside, the rain had lessened, though the stones still glistened beneath the lamps. I walked slowly through the quadrangle, footsteps hollow against the flagstones. Behind one lit window, the scholars resumed their circle, smoke already curling toward the rafters. A college at night is both a fortress and a prison. Secrets thrive in such architecture. I paused beneath the cloister arch and thought again of the crossword clue. Allegro. Light, fast, a deception dressed in brightness. Perhaps the deaths themselves were allegros, swift performances masking slower, darker truths. The music had begun, but the melody remained unfinished. And as I stood listening to the rain dripping steadily from the eaves, I felt certain that more notes were yet to come. It was in the library that I first heard it, not the words themselves, but the faint dissonance of a quotation repeated with too much confidence. One of the junior fellows, keen to display his familiarity with the poets, recited a line while riffling through a volume of Catullus. I cannot remember his exact phrasing now, but what I recall most keenly was that he misquoted it. A single word altered so slightly that his companions, nodding sagely, did not notice. Yet the change hollowed the verse, stripped it of its sting. Misquotes are like fingerprints. They betray the reader's real relationship with the text. He had not read the poem, only memorized its echo. I lingered in the library longer than necessary, walking among the shelves whose spines recorded centuries of argument. Dust fell in slow flurries as I pulled down a folio here, a monograph there. Somewhere above, the rain traced its unending patterns upon the leaded glass. The silence was so complete that even the turning of pages became accusatory, as though disturbing something sacred. It is in such silences that errors echo most loudly. The young fellow with the misquote laughed too easily, laughed again, and folded his newspaper too carefully when he thought no one was watching. I recognized the crossword grid even at a distance. Half completed, ink blotted where he had written too quickly. I saw the clue he had abandoned, a truth twisted by a careless tongue, 9 letters. He had left the space empty, but I supplied the answer in my head, misquote. 9 letters, a small revelation, but one that nested itself neatly against the whisper I had overheard. Life, like the crossword, answers itself if one waits long enough. I took a seat by the window, pretending indifference, and allowed him to approach me. He introduced himself with the nervous energy of youth, eager to impress, eager to matter. His conversation circled around Mrs. Elsmore, whom he described as a woman of unusual fervour. He claimed she had accused one of the trustees of deliberate deceit concerning a set of vases. His words, too smooth, suggested rehearsal. He quoted her, or rather misquoted her, for I had already read her correspondence at the museum. She had written of the silence of clay. He spoke of the purity of clay. A shift so small it might have escaped another listener. but words matter. She had suspected silence, absence, concealment. He offered purity, innocence, and exoneration. The discrepancy was a shadow behind his smile. I asked whether he had known Miss Whitstable, the governess. He looked startled, then recovered too quickly. "No, of course not," he said. "How could he?" Yet his fingers, resting on the table, betrayed him. They moved as though tracing letters in invisible chalk. Teachers' habits die hard. He had known one or both of these women more intimately than he admitted, and he feared that knowledge being discovered. Outside, the quadrangle lay damp and empty, pigeons hunched beneath the cloisters. The lamps had not yet been lit, but the first dimming of daylight crept across the stone. I thought of the two deaths, each arranged as though part of some larger performance, each framed by objects that carried histories of their own. A governess by the fire with Wordsworth, a widow among antiquities. And now a scholar, or a pretender to scholarship, weaving misquotes into his conversation, like a careless mason inserting false stones into a wall. The structure still stood, but the weakness was already visible. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, and suggested that Mrs. Elsmore's death had been natural. Overexertion, perhaps, the stress of her suspicions. His words fell into the hush of the library with calculated ease. Yet his eyes betrayed him. When he looked away, they fixed themselves not on the books, nor on the window, but on the door. Always the door, the gesture of someone measuring escape. A scholar does not glance toward the exit unless he fears his learning will not suffice. I left him there, the crossword abandoned at his elbow, the misquote still lingering like smoke. In the corridor beyond, the air smelled of beeswax and age. The floorboards groaned, as though announcing my departure to the portraits that lined the walls, scholars past and present, all watching, all judging, all complicit in silence. On Beaumont Street the drizzle had begun again, lighter this time, almost playful in its persistence. I pulled my coat close and thought about the nature of error. A misquote, after all, is not always careless. Sometimes it is deliberate, a veil drawn over truth, a redirection of memory. I wondered how many of our present deaths were themselves misquotes, altered versions of reality, rehearsed for the benefit of onlookers. The crossword folded in my pocket rustled as I walked, misquote, 9 letters. I smiled grimly at the neatness of it. The fellow in the library had given me more than he intended. In the end, it is rarely the shouted confession that betrays guilt. It is the whisper, the hesitation, the single word spoken wrongly that leads one down the corridor toward truth. Oxford, in that hour, gave me its usual gift, rain upon stone, silence in the library, and a clue disguised as error. Whether it would lead to revelation or merely to further ambiguity, I could not yet say. But I followed it nonetheless, for I have never been able to ignore the whisper of a misquote. It was in the senior common room that evening that I encountered the peculiar trinity of objects which has stayed with me ever since: a bottle of wine half emptied, a bundle of letters, and the unmistakable absence of a single page torn from a notebook. Each alone might have signified little. Together they whispered like conspirators. The room smelled of port and pipe smoke, that old duet of Oxford evenings. Gowns hung over chairbacks like abandoned skins, and the long table bore the remnants of a dinner too hastily consumed. Glasses tipped slightly, the crimson traces within glinting in the firelight. It is always the wine that betrays truth. A little too much poured, a hand unsteady in its eagerness, words unguarded once the glass has been refilled. Even the professors who spend their lives measuring words betray themselves when claret enters the bloodstream. A cluster of envelopes lay open upon the table, addressed in a hand I recognized, Mrs. Elsmore's, the widow now lying among the dead. The writing was elegant, firm, yet there were scratchings out here and there, as though her thoughts had been hurried, then regretted. I read just enough to catch the tenor of her accusations. She had written of clay too soft to be ancient, of inscriptions mimicked without comprehension. She hinted at a ring of deceit, though whether metaphorical or literal I could not yet decide. The letters had been passed among the fellows like contraband, each adding his stain of wine to the paper as if baptizing it into secrecy. But what caught my eye most was the notebook, small, leather-bound, belonging to one of the dons who claimed it was merely for recording translations. Its pages fluttered as though protesting their exposure. Near the centre, one had been neatly removed. No ragged tear, no accidental damage, a deliberate extraction, performed with the care of someone who wished concealment to masquerade as order. I held the book in my hands a moment longer than necessary, feeling the ghost of the absent page like a missing tooth against the tongue. Emptiness speaks. It was then that I noticed the crossword folded into the notebook's cover. Not the Times this time, but the Telegraph. A clue had been circled in pencil, absent yet eloquent 7 letters. The answer, of course, was silence. I wrote it quietly in my mind, the symmetry pleasing, the coincidence unsettling. A page gone, a word misquoted, a woman silenced. Oxford, with its endless appetite for metaphor, had once again turned crime into literature. I sat with the dons, glass reluctantly in hand. Their conversation moved restlessly between trivialities, the inadequacy of younger students, the declining quality of port, and the undercurrent of suspicion they could not quite silence. Each man sought to control the narrative, to shape Mrs. Elsmore's death into something safe. Only the woman lecturer sat apart, her glass untouched, her eyes on the fire. When our gazes met, I saw the flicker of unease, the knowledge that she too had noticed the missing page. But she said nothing, and I understood her caution. Silence. 7 letters. Later, when the room had emptied into the drizzle beyond the oak doors, I remained. The fire hissed in protest at a log laid too clumsily. I gathered the letters once more, noting the smears of wine across certain lines. One sentence was nearly obliterated by a careless splash, yet I could reconstruct enough of it to see that she had named someone, not directly, but by initial. An M written sharply, as though anger had tightened her hand. M for misquote, M for missing, M perhaps for murderer. Or perhaps merely for mistake. Ambiguity is Oxford's native tongue. The empty glass beside the notebook bore a greasy smear, like a fingerprint unacknowledged. I thought again of Miss Whitstable's spectacles bearing a smear on the wrong lens. Different objects, same gesture. Someone arranging things, repositioning them after life had fled. A curator of death, tidying his exhibits. The idea lodged itself in me, unwelcome, yet persistent. When I finally left the common room, the quadrangle lay washed in moonlight, the rain having exhausted itself for the night. Puddles mirrored the cloisters, turning stone into shadow. I walked slowly, the silence around me pressing too close. Silence. Again. The crossword's answer mocked me, absent yet eloquent. The missing page, the withheld word, the altered quotation all spoke louder than the noise of their replacements. In my rooms later, I poured myself a whiskey and unfolded my own crossword, unfinished from that morning. A clue awaited me, wine's companion, a truth untold 8 letters. I wrote confessor, then crossed it out. Too pious, too neat. I tried redaction. 10 letters, wrong length but closer in spirit. The page, missing from the notebook, hovered in my mind, a redaction without confession, eloquent in its silence. I thought of the wine, staining words into illegibility. I thought of letters bearing accusations no one wished to read. I thought of the absence, carefully cut away, and how absence so often proved more meaningful than presence. And I thought, too, of the way the dons had avoided each other's eyes, each rehearsing innocence while silently rehearsing blame. They had formed a circle around guilt, but left its centre conspicuously empty. Oxford that night gave me no answers, only silence. And yet it was a silence weighted, deliberate, like the pause in a line of poetry before its final word. I went to bed uneasy, the taste of wine still faint on my tongue, the echo of missing words louder than any that had been spoken. It was close to midnight when I found myself once more at the Ashmolean, the corridors long since emptied of visitors, the echo of footsteps belonging only to guards too weary to wonder why I prowled the galleries. I had asked for the curator, and he had agreed to meet me, though his voice on the telephone carried the reluctance of a man already entangled in matters he wished to leave behind. There is always a time of night when truth feels nearer, when pretense frays at its edges. This, I thought, was his secret hour. The building is never entirely dark. Emergency lamps cast greenish glows upon the marble, and moonlight trickled through the tall windows like silver poured too thin. I waited by the Egyptian sarcophagi, the painted eyes watching me with the indifference of centuries. The curator arrived quietly, his shoes squeaking once, then falling silent as though he regretted the sound. He carried with him a bottle, not of wine but of water, though his hands trembled as if the liquid were stronger. He spoke of inventories, of catalogues, of errors in accession numbers. He spoke of thefts in other institutions, of the constant anxiety that authenticity breeds. But I noticed that he never looked directly at the artifacts as he spoke. His eyes drifted instead to the windows, to the doors, anywhere but the relics he was sworn to guard. A man who avoids his treasures has something to hide from them. I let him talk, offering no interruption, until his voice thinned into silence. On a desk in the adjoining office lay a folder. He gestured toward it with the resignation of a man too tired to invent further. Inside I found photographs not of the artifacts themselves but of fragments, enlarged, their inscriptions illuminated beneath forensic light. The letters were too even, too clean, carved by hands that had known modern chisels, not ancient ones. Forgery, whispered the photographs, though they whispered it with elegance. Whoever had fashioned them understood the art of deception. The curator admitted haltingly, as if the word itself resisted that Mrs. Elsmore had discovered irregularities. She had written to him, not with accusations, but with questions pointed enough to draw blood. He had ignored them at first. Later he had sought to dissuade her. A conversation in the gallery, sharp words exchanged. He insisted he had not harmed her. He insisted too quickly. I turned the photographs over one by one until I reached the last. Upon the back in pencil, someone had sketched a crossword clue guardian of falsehood. 10 letters. I thought for a moment, then silently supplied the answer. 10 letters. The hand that had written it might have meant jest or confession. I wondered which. I asked him about the missing page from the notebook. His face twitched, and he said only that records were often redacted for clarity, for neatness. Yet his hand, resting on the table, tightened until the knuckles whitened. I thought of silence again, the crossword's earlier answer. Silence, 7 letters. Curator, 10. Both written in invisible ink across the dead. The clock in the corridor struck 1, its chime hollow against the marble. The curator flinched. He confessed then that he had been in the gallery the night of her death. He had lingered after locking the cases, after the guards had departed, unable to resist the solitude of the statues. He claimed he had left before dawn, leaving Mrs. Elsmore alive, though agitated, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the vases she called fraudulent. He swore he had departed. I watched him as he said it. His eyes, at last, fell upon one of the statues, and his voice broke. A man rarely lies when he breaks, though he often omits. I left him there, his secret hour laid bare, though not complete. Outside, Beaumont Street lay deserted, the rain finally exhausted, the stones dark with memory. I walked toward my rooms, the photographs heavy in my pocket. Forgery, silence, curator, words that fitted like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. Before sleeping, I opened my own crossword. The final clue stared at truth's enemy, cloaked in time 8 letters. I wrote falsehood, then hesitated. Another word pressed itself forward history, 8 letters, both true, both inadequate. Like the curator's hour, the answer hovered between confession and concealment. I closed the paper, the letters unfinished, and poured myself a whiskey. Oxford had given me another fragment, but the whole remained hidden, waiting, perhaps, in the next hour beyond midnight. It was the simplest of explanations and therefore the most dangerous. The young man, the protégé with the quick smile and quicker evasions, had the means, the opportunity, and what seemed to be the most elemental of motives, jealousy. It was a motive as old as the stones of Oxford, and as unconvincing when set beside them. I saw him again in the quad, rain having slackened into a mist that turned the lamps into blurred halos. He stood with an air too still to be accidental, hands thrust in pockets, gaze directed not at the chapel tower, but at the shadows where I lingered. A student would have shuffled, a man guilty of nothing would have glanced away. But he stood, as though daring the silence to accuse him. When at last he noticed me, his face rearranged itself into eagerness too swift to be real. He spoke of loyalty to Mrs. Elsmore, of his devotion to scholarship, of injustices she had whispered to him. Yet each declaration rang hollow, the words polished smooth like stones tossed too often in the pocket. In his rooms I found the familiar detritus of youth books stacked precariously, papers scattered without order, a decanter of cheap sherry half-drained. Among them, a letter, torn, refolded, creased with the violence of handling. Addressed in Mrs. Elsmore's unmistakable hand, its contents were brief and sharp. She had written of promises betrayed, of confidences broken, of trust misused. She named no one, but the letter's presence in his room was damning enough. He tried to laugh it away, claiming it was a draft, discarded, picked up from the bin after one of her visits. Yet he kept it close enough that it revealed more about him than any protestation could conceal. His books, too, betrayed him. On the desk lay a dictionary of Latin inscriptions, open at the page concerning amphorae. I traced the margin with my finger and saw the notes penciled there, notes too recent to belong to the aged volume. One line in particular struck me: authenticity, it touched power. A phrase both arrogant and frightened, the handwriting angular with suppressed fury. I asked him about it. He shrugged, muttering that all scholarship was about power in the end, but the tremor in his voice told me more than his words. As I left, my eyes fell on his crossword puzzle, folded into a book of Horace, as though scholarship could disguise habit. A clue, unfinished desire, twisted into envy 7 letters. He had scrawled jealous, then crossed it out, leaving the boxes empty. I supplied it in my head, the neatness of the answer too tempting. Jealous. 7 letters, too tempting indeed. For it was jealousy that seemed to explain everything. He had envied her knowledge, envied the deference she commanded, envied the influence she wielded in circles that would otherwise have ignored him. Perhaps he had followed her into the museum at night, confronted her, silenced her with too much force, then arranged her body in that ghastly tableau. Perhaps he had even visited Miss Whitstable, the governess, fearful of what she knew. Each detail bent itself to the theory, like iron filings to a magnet. For a time, I allowed myself the luxury of certainty, but certainty, in my trade, is always premature. Too many pieces lay ill-fitting beneath the surface. His youth, for one passion, runs hot, but leaves behind disorder. Yet both deaths bore the calm arrangement of an older hand. His letter from Mrs. Elsmore, yes, it was accused, but it was accused of betrayal, not of forgery. And his misquote in the library was carelessness or intent, a boy's arrogance, or a man's calculation? Too many questions that his guilt could not answer. I walked back across the quad, my mind rehearsing the solution even as it unravelled. Rain gathered again, dripping from the stone gargoyles like tears too patient to fall. The chapel bell tolled the hour, its resonance swallowing my thoughts. I paused beneath the arch and looked back. His window glowed with light, a square of defiance against the darkness. A jealous protégé, yes, but jealousy alone is rarely enough to murder with such art. In my room, whiskey in hand, I opened my crossword. A clue stared back at me. Answer too neat to be true, 11 letters. I wrote falsehood, then crossed it out. Another possibility occurred to me, oversimple. 11 letters, the word settled into place with the inevitability of rain upon stone. A false solution, dressed in elegance, but false nonetheless. Oxford, at that moment, seemed to smile at me with its usual irony. It gives you the answer, then whispers that the answer is wrong. It tempts you with jealousy, with neatness, with youth, too eager to be guilty. And it waits, patient as always, for the hour when truth will finally permit itself to be seen. It was not the crime that led me to the opera that evening, but the habit. A ticket had been purchased weeks before, a small indulgence in Puccini to balance the weariness of investigation. Yet the case followed me, as cases always do, into the theatre's darkness. The chandeliers glittered above, the crimson velvet glowed beneath, and Oxford's learned elite gathered in whispered anticipation. The overture had scarcely begun before I noticed the absences, the silences, the interruptions that mattered more than the music. From my seat, I saw the professor of philology, beard white as chalk, sitting 2 rows ahead. His companion was not his wife, though he leaned toward her with familiarity disguised as courtesy. I watched them with the indifference of a man too used to duplicity. It was not their intimacy that drew my attention, but the letter she unfolded quickly, furtively, as the orchestra swelled. A letter written in the same sharp hand as Mrs. Elsmore's. I glimpsed only a fragment before it was tucked away. The page you removed will not protect you. And then the soprano rose, her voice slicing through the hall, drowning all else. But interruptions define opera as much as arias do. A cough, a stumble, a pause too long. In the second act, the professor left his seat, hurrying up the aisle with the gait of a man pursued not by time, but by conscience. His companion followed minutes later, clutching her handbag as if it contained something volatile. I waited, then slipped out myself, the music fading into a distant echo of violins. The corridors smelled of dust and perfume, the floor creaked beneath hurried feet. I followed at a distance. I found them in the vestibule, whispering fiercely. She held the letter between 2 trembling fingers, demanding something I could not hear. He shook his head, raised a hand as though to placate her, then snatched the paper and tore it cleanly in 2. Pieces fluttered to the floor like confetti for a wedding gone wrong. He stamped once, twice, as though grinding meaning into silence. When they noticed me, it was already too late for pretense. He muttered about drafts, miscommunications, scholarly disagreements. She pressed her lips thin and said nothing at all. I stooped, retrieving a fragment from the marble tiles. Ink blurred, yet legible enough forgery cannot remain hidden. The words sang louder than any soprano. I slipped it into my pocket, said nothing, and let them return to their seats. Their opera was unfinished, and so was mine. The rest of the performance passed in a haze. I heard the music, yes, but beneath it ran another score, accusations whispered, pages missing, letters torn, silences rehearsed. When the curtain fell and the applause erupted, I remained seated, unwilling to join the theatre's ritual of conclusion. Crimes do not resolve themselves with ovations. They linger like notes held too long, vibrating in the chest. Outside, the night was damp again, the cobblestones reflecting the lamplight in broken patterns. The crowd dispersed, laughter and chatter dissolving into the mist. I walked slowly toward Beaumont Street, replaying the scene in the vestibule. The tearing of paper. The crushing of letters beneath a shoe. Too deliberate to be an accident, too theatrical to be guiltless. The professor, the beard, the companion are all part of an opera beyond Puccini's score. In my pocket, the fragment rustled, accusing. At home, with whiskey poured, I unfolded it beside my crossword, the clue waiting for me. Music cut short 7 letters. I tried truncat, then erased it. Cadenza too long. At last, I wrote prelude. 7 letters. An opening, not an ending. An opera interrupted, a crime unresolved. I thought of Mrs. Elsmore, of Miss Whitstable, of the curator's trembling hands. Each death, each lie, each misquote was a prelude, not a finale. The opera had only begun, and Oxford, a patient city of stone and rain, was still writing the libretto. It is pride, not envy, that ruins more men in Oxford. Envy stings, but pride corrodes from within, leaving a man convinced of his invulnerability, even as the stone beneath him crumbles. I began to believe, briefly and wrongly, that pride had killed Mrs. Elsmore and Miss Whitstable, and that pride belonged to the professor with the white beard, whose presence loomed as heavily in the common room as the portraits hanging behind him. He carried himself with the hauteur of a man long accustomed to deference. His lectures were spoken of with reverence, his publications cited with awe, yet his gaze never quite reached the eyes of those he addressed. He dealt in words as though they were coins minted for his exclusive use. When questioned, he answered not the query, but the presumption beneath it. Such men believe themselves incapable of error, which is precisely the error they most often commit. I visited his rooms one evening, rain tapping its slow code against the window panes. He offered sherry, which I declined, and produced a sheaf of papers that he claimed would vindicate the authenticity of the disputed vases. His hand trembled as he unfolded them. The photographs, the translations, the glosses upon glosses, all meticulously arranged, too meticulous. Each sheet bore his initial in the corner, an M written with exaggerated flourish. I thought of Mrs. Elsmore's letters marked too with an M, though hers trembled with fury rather than pride. He was defending himself, and in defending himself, condemning himself, at least so I thought. On his desk lay another crossword, not the Times this time, but the Guardian. The clue unfinished read, "Fatal flaw in noble man," 5 letters. He had written pride, then underlined it twice. The neatness of it struck me as a confession. Pride, 5 letters. He smiled as I noticed it, saying that crosswords were trivial, nothing more than entertainment. But his smile faltered, and I knew he had meant it. Pride, his own word, his own undoing. He admitted, with a scholar's contempt for secrecy, that Mrs. Elsmore had challenged him directly. She had accused him of negligence at best, deceit at worst. He insisted he had dismissed her with courtesy, though his jaw tightened as he spoke. He spoke, too, of Miss Whitstable, the governess, who had once attended his public lecture and asked a question so perceptive it had embarrassed him. He remembered her name longer than he wished. Pride does not forgive correction, not even from a retired governess, especially not from her. The case seemed suddenly clear. He had the motive, pride wounded, reputation endangered. He had the opportunity, access to both women through the circle of scholarship that bound Oxford together like ivy clinging to stone. And he had the temperament, a man too proud to accept correction, too proud to admit forgery, too proud to let two women undermine him. He might have silenced them, arranging their deaths as though curating his own defense. The tableau of serenity, the orderly placement of objects, all spoke of a mind accustomed to arrangement, to order masquerading as truth. I left his rooms convinced, or nearly so. The rain had ceased, and the night air smelled of wet stone and distant smoke. I walked through the quadrangle, hearing my footsteps echo too loudly. The solution seemed too neat, but neatness has its allure. Pride, 5 letters. The crossword had confirmed it, hadn't it? His own hand had supplied the word. I almost allowed myself satisfaction, but satisfaction in Oxford is always premature. Too many details resisted alignment. Why had Mrs. Elsmore's letter been torn in the opera vestibule by his companion, not by him? Why had the missing page from the notebook been cut so carefully, as though by a hand practised in redaction, not scholarship? Why had Miss Whitstable's spectacles borne another's smear? Pride explains much, but pride is careless, and there had been nothing careless about those arrangements. They were too deliberate, too artful, too patient. At home, whiskey poured, I unfolded my own crossword. The clue that awaited me read, answer that deceives solver 12 letters. I filled in misdirection 12 letters. It stared back at me with quiet authority. The scholar's pride was a misdirection, as neat and as false as the jealous protégé's envy. I had been led astray again, seduced by the neatness of motive and the elegance of coincidence. Oxford, in its way, had offered me another false solution wrapped in dignity and underlined twice. Pride had not killed these women. Something else had. But that something still lingered in silence, waiting for the hour when I might finally hear it. The archive was colder than the rain outside, though the day had been one of Oxford's dreary wet spells, the sky bruised grey and heavy. The university's undercroft of records was not built for comfort. It was built for permanence, for dust, for the slow patience of paper, surviving beyond the reach of breath. I went there reluctantly, summoned by an instinct rather than a clue, as though the case itself had driven me down into those dim-lit corridors. A custodian, silent but courteous, unlocked the door and left me with the faint smell of damp wool and lamp oil for company. I moved through the boxes with a care born more of reverence than caution. Archives are cemeteries of words, the names of the forgotten, etched not in stone but in ink, waiting for someone to stumble upon them again. Each box bore numbers, each folder names, each sheet of paper a life compressed into silence. I was looking, though I knew not for what. Perhaps for another absence, a page torn away, a whisper of silence disguised as record. And then, within a file of photographs catalogued under acquisitions, I found it. A glossy black and white, corners frayed, the image faintly blurred as though the shutter had stammered. It showed Mrs. Elsmore in one of the museum's galleries, not alone, but in the company of others. Around her stood 3 figures, the curator, younger by some years, the bearded professor, his pride visible even in monochrome, and at the edge, half turned away, the protégé with the smile too quick. Their faces were all directed toward the same object, a vase she would later accuse of being false. But her eyes, magnified slightly by her spectacles, were turned not toward the vase, but toward the camera, as though she had foreseen the photograph's future relevance. What arrested me most was not her gaze, nor even the array of scholars frozen in their poses, but a detail near the edge of the frame. On the plinth beside the vase lay a folder, half open, a page already loose as though about to fall. The photograph had caught it midriff, not dramatic, not staged. Yet that absent page seemed to hover across time, linking itself to the missing leaf from the notebook, to the torn letter at the opera, to the silences that followed both deaths. A motif of absence, captured before absence, had been enacted. I studied the photograph until the lines blurred. On the reverse, someone had written a note in faint pencil, "Ask." Verification. 1974. File completed. The hand was unfamiliar. I traced the letters anyway, as though touch could translate intent. Verification, the word said. But what had been verified, truth or forgery? The answer lay in the gap, as it always did. The custodian returned briefly, asking if I required light. I shook my head. Too much light ruins an archive. Better to keep the gloom, let one's eyes adjust to its honesty. He lingered, then mentioned, almost apologetically, that Mrs. Elsmore had visited the archive herself not long before her death. She had asked for these very files. She had stayed late, he said, long past the hour of comfort, as though she was searching not for knowledge, but for confirmation of what she already feared. When she left, she carried nothing. Yet he recalled a whisper, perhaps to herself, that silence was more dangerous than speech. He seemed embarrassed to have remembered it, as though overhearing a prayer. I left the archive with the photograph, folded carefully into my coat. Outside, Beaumont Street smelled of wet leaves and petrol, buses hissing as they passed. The photograph burned against my chest like an accusation. Each face, each gesture, each absence told me that the truth was less a matter of discovery than of recognition. I had seen all these fragments before, only their arrangement was new. At home, whiskey close to hand, I unfolded my crossword. The clue that awaited me was an image that conceals more than it reveals 11 letters. I wrote a photograph, then paused. The letters fit, but the word resisted. I tried snapshot. 8. Too short. Representation. 13. Too long. Then I left it blank, realizing that the photograph in my pocket was itself the answer and the non-answer. It revealed the faces, the vase, the page midfall. But it concealed what mattered: who had removed, who had silenced, who had killed. The archive had given me not a solution, but another absence, another silence, another page missing from the story. And Oxford, patient as ever, seemed to breathe around me, rain pattering against the window pane like fingers on a locked door, waiting for me to open it. It was past midnight when I returned to the museum. The city was quiet in that way it rarely is, the drizzle exhausted, the pavements washed clean of footsteps. Only the lamps burned on Beaumont Street, halos of pale light cast across the slick stone. Oxford never truly sleeps, but it sometimes pretends. I carried the photograph in my pocket, its edges softening with each hour, as though time itself conspired to erase its evidence. The night guard admitted me without a word. By now, he knew better than to ask questions. Oxford has taught its servants silence as a form of loyalty. My shoes clicked against the marble, echoing too loudly in the deserted galleries. I went to the place where Mrs. Elsmore had been found, and I sat. Not in her chair, not in her posture, but close enough to feel her absence. The fire grate was empty, yet I imagined it still smouldered, the way memory smoulders long after the flame has gone. Reconstruction is not theatre, though it always risks becoming so. I placed the photograph on the table, 4 faces frozen in monochrome, each a fragment of truth and deceit. I arranged in my mind the spectacles with their smear, the page carefully cut from a notebook, the torn letter, the fragment in my coat pocket, the wine stains bleeding across accusations. I set them together like pieces of a mosaic, though the image they formed resisted clarity. It was not a portrait, not yet, but a suggestion of one. I tried to imagine the steps. A woman arrives at night, drawn by suspicion. She confronts the evidence vases too neat, inscriptions too deliberate. She voices her doubts. Someone is there with her, perhaps already waiting, perhaps following her. There is anger, yes, but more than anger. A need for order, a need for silence. The spectacles are removed, wiped, replaced, not by her own hand. The body is arranged, serenity curated, a forgery of death to mirror the forgery of art. And before that, another woman, the governess, found seated with Wordsworth. She too had asked questions once, perhaps at a lecture, perhaps in private. She too had unsettled pride and challenged the neat arrangement of falsehoods. Her death also curated, her room tidied, her serenity staged. 2 deaths, alike not in motive but in method. A hand practiced in arrangement, in turning disorder into exhibit. A curator's hand, perhaps, or the hand of one who longed to curate the truth itself. I thought of the opera, the letter torn in fury. I thought of the professor's pride, the protégé's envy, each false solution offered like an aria cut short. And I thought of the curator, his voice trembling as he confessed to being present that night, his denial too swift, his silence too long. The photograph bore him younger, less careworn, but already watchful, already guarding more than artifacts. Pride and jealousy are noisy sins. Silence is far more dangerous. The crossword in my pocket awaited me. I unfolded it, the pencil already dull. The clue I had circled earlier returned my gaze to piece together again what has been broken 13 letters. I filled it in with quiet certainty. 13 letters. The word fitted the boxes as neatly as the photograph fitted its frame. But the act itself was never neat. Reconstruction is always haunted, always incomplete. It offers fragments, never the whole. I rose and walked through the galleries slowly. The statues loomed in their niches, shadows stretched across the marble. I traced the line of cases, each pane of glass reflecting not only the objects within, but my own face, tired, hollowed by whiskey and hours. In one reflection, I thought, just for a moment, I saw another beside me, a blur, a distortion, as though someone walked a pace behind. I turned, of course. There was no one. Yet the sensation lingered that I was not the only one reconstructing that night. I left the photograph on the desk, though I could not explain why. Perhaps I wished to accuse them without me. Perhaps I wished to shed the weight of its silence. The guard locked the doors behind me, and I stepped again into Beaumont Street, where the rain had begun once more, fine as dust, tapping at my coat, reminding me that Oxford prefers its truths blurred. In my room, I poured the last measure of whiskey and sat with the crossword before me. Reconstruction, 13 letters, the grid now filled. And yet no satisfaction came, for crosswords end with completion, cases rarely do. I had pieced together fragments, yes, but each piece revealed another absence, another silence. I had reconstructed not certainty, but ambiguity. And perhaps that was the truest answer Oxford would permit. It was, after all, midnight, the hour of reconstruction, the hour when even falsehoods arrange themselves into temporary coherence before dissolving once more into the shadows of stone and rain. The statues never move, and yet they shift each time one looks at them. By daylight they are teaching aids, admired, measured, catalogued. By night they are witnesses, their blind eyes holding more memory than those of us who walk beneath them. It was among them that I ended, as perhaps I always would, walking slowly through the gallery long after the hour had called for rest. The air smelled of dust and stone, faintly metallic, as though the past itself had bled into the present. I had reconstructed, or tried to, the photograph, the letters, the missing pages, the spectacles, the neatness of every tableau. I had rehearsed the false solutions, envy, pride, and abandoned them as one abandons crosswords filled too hastily. I circled back, again and again, to silence. The silence of forgery, the silence of curated death, the silence of Oxford's corridors. It was not a solution in the way courts demand, but it was the nearest I could come. And so I returned to the statues to see whether they might bear the weight of such unfinished answers. The gallery was empty, save for the guard, who nodded once and retreated, glad to be free of marble faces. I sat on the bench opposite the vases that had begun it all, their painted figures still striding across clay that pretended to be older than it was. Forgery or not, they carried their own truth, that men crave permanence, and will fashion it even from falsehood. I stared at them until their lines blurred into shadow. The photograph came back to me. 4 faces turned toward the vase, 1 toward the camera. Mrs. Elsmore, eyes magnified, already aware she was staring into posterity. I thought of her words, of silence more dangerous than speech. I thought of Miss Whitstable, book open on her lap, Wordsworth unknowing companion. Both women framed, arranged, silenced. And behind them, men with motives too neat, too noisy, too human. Envy, pride, jealousy. But beneath those noises, something quieter, something colder, arrangement itself. The act of turning life into tableau. Who had done it? I could trace the outlines, but not the hand. I walked among the statues. Their plinths bore inscriptions half faded, the Latin phrases breaking beneath the weight of centuries. I paused before one, a headless Apollo, and remembered the crossword clue still lingering unfinished in my pocket. An answer without a head 6 letters. I smiled grimly and filled it in at last. Clue? 6 letters, too obvious, too simple. But perhaps the point was that we seek hidden meanings, yet often the answer stands headless, in plain sight, asking only to be seen. The echo of footsteps accompanied me. My own, of course, though at times I fancied another followed. The curators, the protégés, the professor's pride, each had left their prints in the dust of this case, but the trial never reached a conclusion. That is the cruelty of Oxford. It does not reward resolution, it rewards endurance. It asks only that you walk long enough among the stone to know you too will one day be silent, arranged, forgotten. I sat again, listening to the building breathe. The rain had ceased outside, but water still dripped somewhere within, a slow metronome marking time. I thought of the 2 women, their final hours curated like exhibits. I thought of the men who had circled them with motives too clear, and of the silences that spoke more loudly than words. And I thought of myself, seated here, whiskey not yet poured, pencil dull, waiting for a solution that would never fully arrive. When I left the gallery, the statues watched me go with their blind serenity. I did not look back. Some cases demand endings, this one demands silence. In my room I opened the crossword to its last blank. The clue read, "What remains when all else is absent?" 7 letters. I wrote silence. 7 letters. The word filled the grid, filled the hour, filled the case. Among the statues that night I learned again what I should never forget. That silence is never empty. It is always arranged, and it is always waiting.